Well, thank you to Cook County Higher Ed for having me come in and chat with you. Um, I see a lot of familiar names out there as well, so that's nice to see some friends of mine. Um, yeah, it's if I can sit and talk fur trade, I'm a happy man. Yeah, for over 30 some years, this is all I've done basically is research and study and enjoy teaching the history of the fur trade. Um, I've been here at Grand Portage National Monument basically from about 1997, 1998 on, um, and involved in many aspects of the park. Um, Today, the talk it's going to be pretty open. It's going to be on the Great Lakes or Canadian fur trade, but with an emphasis on Grand Portage. That is the key to the talk today. So we're actually going to be going from about the 1500s all the way up to about 1840. We're going to cover a huge swath of time. And I think it's going to go quick. I think we're going to have fun. I think for many of you, it's going to be old hat. But every time you listen to these, you always pick up at least something that's new. And for some of you, it's going to be all new, which is fantastic. Um, Now I'm sitting here just yards away from not only Lake Superior, but the Grand Portage Trail. The reason we're in Grand Portage and Grand Portage National Monument, and we're going to get to that whole Portage Trail itself. But, most of the time when we're talking fur trade, and you mention fur trade anywhere in the United States, usually you get people with that romantic vision of these grizzled, bearded trappers sitting in the West, the mountain men with their traps, trapping these furs for profit. Very romantic. You've seen the movies like Jeremiah Johnson and all these movies of guys out in the West, and um, that's not what I'm talking about today. Yeah, people want to hear those great stories, and they are fun Western stories of the mountain. But that's a later time frame. We're going to take it back to the early beginnings. Why did the fur trade begin, and what is the fur trade all about, and what makes our fur trade important? You hear so much of Western fur trade, but you don't hear about the Great Lakes fur trade, the Canadian fur trade, which is actually insane because the size of our fur trade was pretty immense, and it opened up a lot. So what started our fur trade for us here in North America? Where did this fur trade come from? There has to be a need for stuff in order for people to get into the business of supplying. And unique thing about the fur trade was that what created the fur trade was fish. And that's a fascinating little thing there, and here in Grand Portage and fish go right together. I mean, we're sitting on Lake Superior, the whole North Shore and commercial fishing, so fish is important. But the fish I'm talking about is primarily cod up in Newfoundland, up in even Quebec in that area, that far east coast of fishing in the 1500s. It was during the 1500s and 1600s where we saw amazing amount of people coming over for fish. Besides farming, which was the number one occupation for the average person, fishing was usually number two in most countries and most places. The quest for fish, for everything from fertilizer to feeding people to everything. So what we see is, of course, in the 1500s, we see Basque fishermen and English fishermen. We see French fishermen. We see all these people coming over to this new world to obtain this cod that will last forever and never run out. You can walk on their backs all the way from North America all the way to England because these fish will never run out. Well, of course, it does start to run out eventually. But some of these people, especially some of the French, and when they're here collecting this fish, one of the first things they've noticed in their journals is of local flora and fauna. They notice the local native people, and they notice one thing, that many of these native people were intrigued by things these fishermen had. And when I'm talking things, I'm mostly talking about material culture. shiny buttons on their clothing or knives, things like that, which were unusual and strange to the inhabitants of North America who were here. So to entice, of course, something beautiful to these fishermen, of course, furs are waved in the airs. And of course, that was always valuable. So that's where the trade begins. It starts as a fish trade, which goes into furs with the native populace. So we're going to see the furs start leaving North America right about that time in the late 1500s, early 1600s is when it's picking up. And it's just the time, that you start seeing the use of furs going up in Europe as well. Now, when we're talking fur, and we're going to be doing that for the next hour, almost every time we mention the word fur, we're referring to one certain type, though all furs were accepted in the fur trade. And of course, that's the fur that you're all screaming in your heads right now. The beaver. Yes, of course, it is the beaver, the second largest rodent in the world. The largest, by the way, in case you're doing a crossword puzzle tonight, would be the capybara, I believe, down in South America. We're talking about the beaver tonight. Now, what you also know, of course, and I have a beaver right here to show you, so I'm not here totally alone tonight. This beaver right here, the main use for beaver, of course, is all of you probably know as well, since you probably have some interest in the fur trade because you're listening to me tonight. And that would be, of course, the beaver use in the hatting industry. Let me just briefly go into that because people have this confusion that a beaver felt hat is going to look something like this, and that's not what we're looking at all. There's three parts of a beaver hide that I'm holding here. Now, the first part of the beaver is the lovely fur that you all see. It's gorgeous, it's beautiful, it's pretty. That's not used in hat making. This is actually pulled off and discarded in the hat making process. The other side, of course, of the hide is that lovely leather. It's a strong leather. It's not thin like a skunk or a fox would be. It's tough. It's stout. It's good leather. Unfortunately, it's also not used in the hat making process. It's tossed out as well. That doesn't leave us with much. I understand that. But there is one layer that we have not talked about, and that's what's between the leather and the outside fur. And to see that missing part of the beaver is we almost have to bend the beaver here a little bit and pull back some of the fur, and you really can't see, but there's a small little gray fuzzy layer inside here. Quite often it's easy to see on a beaver hide when you're looking at the edge of it, and you can see this little gray fuzzy layer right there. See that? Yeah, it's a good view right there. That right there, that undercoating of the beaver is what is used in the hat making process back in Europe and all over the world, even to this very day. It's this inner fur right here, which is compressed with not much more than water and pressure, which creates from numerous beaver your fine felted hats, of course, of compressed beaver fur. There is nothing in this hat here but strong beaver being compressed together. And that's that fashion that, of course, is setting off this fur trade. So these hats are popular in the 1500s and 1600s. Now, it doesn't mean that we're the only spot for these furs. North America, of course, there are furs. They're the Eurasian beavers. They're over there in Europe. China had beaver, Europe had beaver. Yeah, there is beaver over there. But as the fur trade continued, they rapidly, especially when we get to the 1700s, they're about gone. One estimate actually believes that by the year 1800, less than 600 Eurasian beavers still existed. So they're about gone. Because when we start talking about numbers being shipped out of Minnesota, where I'm sitting, you're going to see that 600 doesn't mean a lot. So we got our start of the fur trade. Now, who's doing this fur trade? Obviously, the fisherman doesn't continue with this. Someone has to come in and start catching these furs. So what we're going into now is the real start of the fur trade. And the fur trade starts with those who have the access into the interior for furs. The interior, which I mean getting off the Atlantic coast and moving inland. And that, of course, is going to be people, especially in that Montreal and Quebec area. These would be, of course, your French Canadians primarily. These French are going to be involved with the fur trade, and they don't form any large fur companies. They're basically independents. It's Bob and Joe, and they have a sack full of things they want to trade, and they walk out with their canoe and go paddle and meet some local native people and do a trade. It's that simple. They're not building trading posts. They're not going out there. They're going out there, they're trading, and they're leaving. No one's permanent. No one's sticking around. Everyone seems to be happy. I mean, when the fur trade begins, it begins in a real simple way, like many things do. But as we'll find out, it doesn't stay pretty. We're going to get to some ugliness probably in this whole fur trade business. I mean, when the fur trade begins, you have to look at it in this simple way. Let's say, down the road between me and Grand Marais, Minnesota, across many rivers. Let's say we're sitting there at the Brule River, okay, outside of Hovland, Minnesota. And we're a native family. We're inside our bark lodge. We are sitting in there, and I have a sharpened piece of stone, a flint, basically trying to cut this beaver up to feed my family. And I have to take that beaver meat and I have to somehow cook it either over the fire on a stick, or I can put it in a birch vessel, which means I'd have to probably throw some hot rocks into that vessel to get the water hot enough to cook the rice and to cook the beaver. It's just a lot of work. But now I need to obtain these furs for clothing, for bedding, to keep my family comfortable and to feed my family. But all of a sudden, there comes the knock on my door, and it's one of these traders. They want to trade for furs. Well, what do they offer? Well, we're going to see a knife being offered. Well, instead of 2.5 hours to cut up this beaver with a flint knife, I can do it in a half hour with this knife that came all the way from Sheffield, England. Now, instead of waiting for hours, taking hot stones to put inside that birch bark vessel to cook, he wants to give me a kettle produced maybe in England as well, maybe produced in France. He brings me this kettle. Now I don't have to sit around and cook with these hot rocks. I put the kettle right over the fire, boom, it's done. So he gives me an axe which is going to chop 5 times quicker than a stone axe. I've just saved myself 5 hours from chopping wood. I saved myself 2 hours from skinning out this beaver. That is 7 more hours I have to play on Facebook, So, these things are making life easier. Now, here's the key to all this. Yes, you do want these new things. We all want these new fancy things, but they want something in return. And of course, it's going to be the fur. So I'm sure these people living in these bark homes of any of the tribes the fur trade have dealt with are probably saying, you probably want a real nice fur, a marten, a mink, an otter. It probably came to a shock to the native person when the fur trader said, you know what I would really like? Beaver. Because I'm sure the native person probably said, beaver? They're all over the place, right? They're probably one of the easiest things to obtain. They live in those dams. You find a dam, you find beaver. There's 1 to 16 beaver in each dam, right? They're really easy to get for us, right? Yeah. And that's what you want. Yep. Well, okay. I will go out and get you a really nice, shiny, dark, large beaver for this knife and this kettle. And then another shocker probably came. I'm sure that one of the trappers probably said, one of the traders probably said, you know what? Behind you lays a beaver hide. It's one you probably killed weeks ago. You probably fed your family with it. You've been stepping on it every morning, waking up, rubbing your feet on it when you come in from outside. All those outside hairs are breaking off and falling off. It's looking pretty gnarly. instead of getting me a nice new one, could I get that old one in back of your house? That one back there? Because remember, this outside hair is useless. That older hide, that inside hair is already, because of age and use, starting to nap together. It makes this a more valuable hide to that trader. So basically what we have just witnessed as a fur supplier, being these native people, what we've just witnessed is someone literally coming into your house, bringing you new gifts from around the world. And in return, they want your old carpeting out of your basement. So it starts pretty simple. The fur trade really starts. So you have these independents, and they don't have to drive or move basically this far west, because the beaver is all over North America. Talking to any kind of biologist or scientist today, they will tell you North America has more beaver today and had more beaver 5,000 years ago and had more beaver 20,000 years ago than anywhere on the planet that had beavers. It's always been the most hugest grounds of beaver in the world, especially Canada. Canada's all water. There's water all over Western Canada. So the beaver is there, but when the fur trade begins, they don't have to penetrate that far. There is still beaver around the Great Lakes. We're going to see our first explosion happen right now. We have gotten to the year 1670. Yeah, there's still those French traders. They're coming around the Great Lakes area. Oh yeah, they're coming around, they're trading, and they're leaving with furs. But in 1670, of course, the first explosion of fur trade begins. The big number, 1670 is the year. That, of course, is the founding of the Hudson's Bay Company. You can't talk fur trade without mentioning those guys, of course. Now, Hudson Bay, it's because of the French once again. You've heard of those guys, Radisson and Grossier, right? Got a couple of French guys here that want to start a large fur company. Now, we haven't heard really the word company used yet. Mostly independent guys involved with the fur trade. 1670, of course, a royal charter by Prince Rupert is written up in England, and the Hudson Bay Company is formed. Now, they're going to form, and they're going to start having a fur post, yes, a permanent building designed for the fur trade. And they're going to build it up where they believe lots of beaver live, way up north on Hudson's Bay, straight north of where I'm sitting, way up there. And the advantage of Hudson Bay, of course, is that it's a water route that goes back out to the Atlantic. So between the Hudson Bay offices in London and the fur factories on Hudson Bay, you have a direct, simple route. Transportation is always key in the fur trade. Transportation will make up throughout the fur trade about 70 to 75% of all the money involved in the fur trade. An average fur trade company, think about 70% of their money being involved in transportation. So Hudson Bay thinks they have the perfect plan. They have a little water route between London and Hudson's Bay where they can bring the things in they want to trade: kettles, blankets, beads, tobacco, alcohol. We'll get into those a little more later. So they could trade with the local populace for the furs. So Hudson Bay starts in 1670. They are a company sitting there. There is no intermarriage at this time with the local people. There is no come inside the trading post. Are we still there? Yeah. Okay. And the trade is going on pretty well. Another thing Hudson Bay is doing is they have set standard prices, and these prices are pretty set and they're pretty standard, and they're decided over in London. So if the weather is bad in northern Canada, which of course it can be, it doesn't affect prices at all because the guys over in London are calling all the shots. They don't allow many of their customers, the natives bringing in furs, into their trading posts. They're just kind of standing outside. They're basically just operating the drive-in window of the fur trade world. That's what they are. You can't go in and sit in McDonald's. You have to order through the window. It's kind of like the COVID deal, but it's the fur trade and it's up on Hudson's Bay. And that's how the Hudson Bay Company is operating. So they operate that way. Once in a while, they start going south a little bit. They're running into a couple of the French traders in Montreal and Quebec, and that causes a little bit of friction. We're looking 1720s, but by the 1730 era, whoa, explosion number two. Now, if you're following along, 1670 was the big explosion. 1670, Hudson Bay forms. But what happens in 1730? That's the other big number we're looking at. It's about 1730, 1731. Right there, we have a visitor in my neck of the woods. Yeah, it's one of those French guys, of course. It's a guy called Pierre La Vérendrye. Now, who is this Pierre La Vérendrye? He's a French explorer. He's a military man. But here he is in my lovely state of Minnesota. In fact, he's in Cook County. In fact, he's in Grand Portage. Here's something unique since we're here with the Cook County higher education. Cook County, of course, is named after Cook. Cook was a military man, Civil War soldier, and that's who this county is named after. If you went down to St. Paul today and you looked up the records of the founding of this county itself, you can actually see that it's not one of the original names for the county. One of the original names for this county that I'm sitting in right now was La Vérendrye County. One thought was it was too difficult to pronounce, so they went with Cook. But that's how important La Vérendrye was. Who is this guy? What makes 1730 La Vérendrye, what makes him so important in this whole talk tonight? Well, La Vérendrye does something pretty amazing. In fact, it was so amazing that in 1931, I believe, there was a celebration called La Vérendrye Days. And they had a huge celebration between Grand Portage and Grand Marais. In fact, some of the celebration happened in Grand Portage. Some of it happened at NWCo Lodge, which was brand new. They were just getting it going when the market crashed. They had to stop that. Some of it was happening in Grand Marais. It was a celebration, La Vérendrye Days. In fact, they minted in 1931 bicentennial coins, and it all celebrated La Vérendrye. What did he do? He was the man who discovered the Grand Portage, which is kind of a weird thing to say because the Grand Portage did not need to be discovered. Now, he may be the first European to learn about the Grand Portage. Obviously, locals in Grand Portage, the local populace of Native people who lived here, have used it for thousands of years. Prior to them, it was a game trail. It's a simple trail. It's 8.5 miles linking two bodies of water. We're going to talk about that pretty much in depth, but it was La Vérendrye who was credited with finding and discovering and letting the world know about the Grand Portage. Now, that's pretty special. I'm pretty amazed that in 1931, one of the largest celebrations to occur in Cook County happened because of Pierre La Vérendrye. You wouldn't think that, because today, in 2021, if we would have a large celebration of La Vérendrye and have La Vérendrye Days once again, I don't think it would probably be as big of celebration as it was in 1931. They'd probably get about 3 people to visit, and I'd be counted as 2 because I'm a pretty big guy. So La Vérendrye finds out about this portage. It's the 1730s. The word's getting out that there is now a water route. Well, there is now a way. Let's say this. There is now a way to go west of the Great Lakes. Because in the 1720s and 1730s, everyone knew the Western Great Lakes, where I'm sitting right now, was the end of the world. Everyone you talked to in Europe knew, oh, you want to go west? you go across the Atlantic Ocean, you get into the St. Lawrence. The St. Lawrence takes you into the Great Lakes. You go across all the Great Lakes, you get to the last one, Lake Superior. You go to the western edge of Lake Superior. That's kind of it. Kind of ends right there. How do you go more west? We're at the western end right here. This is the wild, wild west, but it's La Vérendrye who finally tells us that you can go more west. He knows the secret, and the secret is this 8.5-mile gap, a geographic wonder, a simple gap between hills. Have you ever been here on the North Shore of Minnesota, especially up in Grand Portage area? You know these ancient diabase cliffs, these dramatic, huge walls of rock that create the high falls of the Pigeon River, that creates the dramatic looks around Waswaganing Bay, these huge exposed ancient, basalt cliffs. How do you get around that? How do you, the original idea was, what you do is you get to the western edge of Lake Superior and you take the Pigeon River, because that of course separates Canada from the US. You just take the Pigeon River and you go west, but you can't do that. And a lot of you know why, because a lot of you have been there. Yeah, that's where Grand Portage State Park is. If you take the Pigeon River in from Lake Superior, you only go about a mile before hitting the high obstacle known as the High Falls, 120-foot drop. And let's say you would carry your canoe around that waterfall. Well, could you then go west? Not easily, because you'd hit another fall and another falls and another falls and some cascades and some rapids. Oh, and some more falls. Yeah, the first 20 miles of the Pigeon River is totally impassable. So the next thought would be, well, how do you go west if you can't do it on the Pigeon River? Well, that's where La Vérendrye comes in. He discovers that gap through the hills called the Grand Portage. And that's where I'm speaking from. An 8.5-mile link connecting two bodies of water. Yes, we're connecting Lake Superior, that access back out to the Atlantic. We're connecting Lake Superior, 8.5 miles of dirt until you get to the Pigeon River. But it's the Pigeon River where it now becomes navigable. So yes, you can travel west. The key to the fur trade was just found. How important will it be? Let's find out. We've made it now to the 1740s. People know of the Portage Trail, but no one can take advantage of it. 1750s, people know more about the Grand Portage Trail, but nobody can take advantage of it because in the 50s, the world starts on fire. Yep, we're at another strategic point in history. 1755, we're getting close there because in the late 1750s and 1760s, of course, we got for about 7 years, we got the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War, of course, if you remember from your history books, is basically France and England fighting over the control of North America. Who gets the benefit for owning this place? Is it the French? Is it the British? They're going to fight back and forth, and it will end in 1763. Now, once again, if you remember your history books, it was the British that won. Now the British are involved in the fur trade. Remember those French guys who were coming out here early on by themselves? They can't do that anymore. If you want to be involved in this business known as the fur trade, you better be British and you better have a license because everything's regulated. Some things don't change. So the British, of course, are here now, and they know about the Portage. They've heard about it, and they start coming to Grand Portage. The fur trade's about to get a lot bigger, folks. Everyone knows now that you can go west from Grand Portage. And that's an important thing because it's the 1770s. Those beaver in Europe, it's official, folks, they're gone. It's time for North America to supply the world with beaver. And we just happen to know that most of the beaver is in North America, but we also happen to know that most of the beaver is northwest of the Great Lakes. And now we know how to get there. We have a direct route thanks to La Vérendrye. So 1770s, everyone starts showing up here to be involved with the fur trade. And no one even needs to go all the way up the trail. There are so many Native people in Canada who heard of the traders at Grand Portage that they started rushing out of the interior of Canada, coming down the Grand Portage Trail because they knew about it. They knew about it for years. They were coming down to meet the traders. Natives are coming down from Canada. Traders are coming from Montreal, British traders setting up in Grand Portage. There are hundreds of traders in Grand Portage. I find this pretty amazing. This is the 1770s. I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds of traders and natives gathered here on the bay in Grand Portage. Right now, as I sit here, it's 6:34. Right now, there's probably about 250 people living in Grand Portage. Right now, there were more than that in 1772 here. Is that not amazing? That makes us one of those weird places in the world, one of these places that was more populated during the fur trade than it is right now. So, all these traders are here. They're all trying to get a good deal. They're all trying to cut each other's throats. They're all trying to outdo each other. No, trade with me, I'll give you 4 knives for those beaver hides. No, trade with me, I'll give you 6. Don't trade with that guy, you can't trust him. It's getting ugly around here. One of the famous explorers in history, Mr. Alexander Henry, shows up and he says, oh, it's ugly in Grand Portage. All these traders are each other's throats. Yeah, it's getting serious. In fact, it was so serious that it got violent around here. Most of these English traders here were employing laborers who were French Canadians, a lot of them involved with the trade early on. You see, there's 3 major players we should look at in the fur trade. Since we're hitting the peak of the fur trade right now, there are 3 major players in the fur trade. Let's look at them for a second. British. Yeah, number 1. It's the British. Now, it's the British who purchase the trade goods. It's the British who benefit from selling furs. It's the British that by law can trade when the French cannot. The British are the traders, all right? Then we have the Native people. Tons of Native people. All the ones we've traded with. The Iroquois, the Odawa, the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Carrier, the Slavey, the Grovants, the Mandans, the Hidatsas, the Arikaras, the Dog Ribs, the Yellowknives. Yeah, about 12 different of these tribes had dealt with fur trade companies. Now, we have all these natives who supply all the furs in the fur trade, or at least 98, 99%. Now, there is a confusion a lot of people have who do visit fur trade posts, especially here in Minnesota. They want to hear those stories where I mentioned a long time ago about the grizzled, bearded trappers. Sorry, folks, different fur trade. We're Great Lakes / Canadian fur trade. We don't have trappers. I mean, we do, but our trappers are the proud Native people who call this place home to this very day. Furs are supplied by Native people. There's one person I've left out. Traders, British. Trappers or fur suppliers, Natives. Who are we missing? The middleman, the voyageur. People always want to hear about that guy. Yeah. There's more stories about voyageurs. I could sit here for the next 7 hours. Unfortunately, 6 of those hours are going to be lies about them. No one has more lies told about them in the history. As what Paul Bunyan did to the reality of loggers in Minnesota, well, the Voyageurs, they have just as many false stories. You've heard them all. They all sounded apparently like Pepe Le Pew. They all spoke bad French English. How you doing? Huh? Good to see you. No, not many spoke English at all. They were all very short, 5 foot or shorter, you know? No, not necessarily, you know? They all love their job. I mean, who wouldn't love their job of portaging 180 pounds on your back and paddling 15 hours a day? No, probably not. Who were voyageurs? People tell me all the time they're related to voyageurs in Minnesota, or they know of the voyageurs, or they studied voyageurs in Minnesota, the guys who trapped and traded and paddled across Minnesota. Well, sorry, folks, they didn't trap really much at all, and they didn't trade. I just told you the trappers are natives, the traders are British. Who are the voyageurs? If you're young out there listening to me tonight, I'm going to give you the big secret. Who are voyageurs? It doesn't get any more simpler than this, folks. Who are voyageurs? They're the truck drivers of the fur trade. The canoes, yeah, those are trucks. Yeah, the rivers are the highways. Voyageurs, someone's got to move the stuff the British are trading. The voyageurs, someone's got to move the furs the natives are obtaining and trapping. That's the role of the voyageur. French Canadians working for British fur companies, and no one hired more than the fur companies employed in Grand Portage. So now we know our 3 players of the fur trade. Now, the voyageurs, in order to do their job, especially at Grand Portage, we bring back our friend here, the canoe. You come visit me at Grand Portage, you'll see me make the full size ones, but this is a small model I made a couple of years ago. Now, the canoe makes the fur trade definitely grow, and it makes it possible. Remember, up north, we talked about Hudson Bay for a while, and we'll get back to those guys just shortly. But remember, the Hudson Bay Company, they're not going many places. They're staying on the bay. They're waiting for natives to come to them with furs. But here in Grand Portage, folks are showing up, and they're coming here to trade with natives. And what got them here was the birch bark canoe. Now, the birch bark canoe is pretty unique because to make a birch bark canoe, you need 3 things in this world. What you need, of course, is birch bark. We're talking that white paper birch bark. You've all seen those trees before. You know, the canoe is all lashed together with the roots of the black spruce. You got to have black spruce. You know, that black spruce also gives us this pitch that we use to cover the stitching of the black spruce. And of course, the framework of the entire canoe is all made out of northern white cedar. So you need black spruce, white cedar, and birch bark to make a canoe. Now, the problem with that we have is that if I go a little basically west of where I'm sitting right here, I lose my northern white cedar. Yeah, I start running into the western red cedar. And if I go a little south of where I'm sitting here in Grand Portage, I lose my paper birch, you know? And if I just go a little east, let's say like into Wisconsin, I lose a lot of that black spruce. You know, here in Cook County, we got black spruce bogs all over the place. So there only is a thin little belt in North America that has those 3 certain plants, that has the northern white cedar, that has the black spruce, you know, that has all the trees I need, right? The black spruce, the cedar, and the paper birch. That little band starts about, oh, like North Dakota, Minnesota, and it goes across the top of Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan, and it kind of goes up towards Maine, and it kind of creeps along the Canadian border. Those are like the only places that have the perfect materials to build birch bark canoes. I mean, you can build them in other places, but the best birch bark canoes, you need those three materials, and they just happen to be in Grand Portage, where it's very dominant. Now, how crazy is that? How crazy is it that the Grand Portage Trail and the proper materials for building birch bark canoes is right at the same spot? I'm going to go back to that in just a second. But let me tell you a little more about the birch bark canoe and what happens here at Grand Portage. Grand Portage is a pretty unique location. Obviously, everyone's showing up here and they're starting to cut each other's throats practically. The fur trade's getting heated. So what happens? Well, a bunch of the guys hanging out in Grand Portage in 1779, they know that next year more fur traders will show up and there'll be more here. And the more fur traders at Grand Portage, the smaller your piece of the pie is going to be when those furs start rolling in. So what happens? Well, bunch of them get together and form a little club. Yeah, bunch of guys. They get together in 1779. I'm going to give you their names. Well, some of their names: McTavish, Mackenzie, McGilvery, McDonald, MacDonnell. Are you seeing a theme? Yeah, they're all Scots. These Scots get together and they form a little outfit called the North West Company. They're going to be a huge fur company. They're going to go after the big guys, Hudson Bay. They want to compete with them. So all these little tiny fur companies have to leave Grand Portage because the big one just started in 1779. You know, it did so well that in 1784, they made up a total official agreement, had it notarized and everything. And you can call that also the birth date of the Northwest Company. The 1779 trial run did so well that in 1784, the Northwest Company begins. Basically, a Scottish company. Well, here's what really it is. It's a British company with French Canadian workers trading with natives in the United States, which will become the United States. So it's quite a confusing thing to think about. But it starts here in 1784, and they have some radical ideas on how to become the world's largest fur trade company. Well, one of their ideas, of course, is believing in exploration. They want to become the world's first door-to-door salesman. We know there are natives sitting between Hudson Bay and Minnesota, and they are deciding, should we take our furs north to Hudson Bay, or should we take them south to Grand Portage? Should we trade with Hudson Bay or Northwest Company? Where should we go? What should we do? Northwest Company in Grand Portage does not want that to occur. We want those furs. So we are going to become, speaking of the Northwest Company, since the fur trade depot is just out my window here, they're going to become the world's first door-to-door salesman. What they're going to do is they're going to find every native they can to trade with. And they're going to do it with the birch bark canoe, because we just happen to have a fur post right on the trail into the unknown West. Well, it's not going to be unknown for long. One of the great men who walked these grounds where I'm sitting right now was, of course, Sir Alexander Mackenzie. He was knighted for a pretty good reason. You see, working for the Northwest Company in 1789, Mr. Mackenzie took a canoe right here from Grand Portage, right here, Cook County, Minnesota, and looking and exploring in 1789, he did the impossible, for he reached the Arctic Ocean from here. That's pretty impressive, but he wasn't done, because in 1793, Mr. Mackenzie shocked the entire world. It was on July 22nd of 1793 that Alexander Mackenzie and his crew of men, with their canoe, had reached the Pacific coast. It's pretty amazing. 10 years later, two guys called Lewis and Clark get pretty famous for being the second guys to reach the Pacific Ocean. Few people talking about the first guy, Mr. Mackenzie, the guy who came from Grand Portage. That's pretty important. Now, why is that confusion there? I tell that every day to people visiting us, and they're always confused. That's because Lewis and Clark did an amazing thing. They were fantastic explorers. They were the first to reach the Pacific Ocean by crossing the United States, a difficult task. Mr. Mackenzie, he was the first to reach the Pacific coast by crossing North America. There's a difference. He did it the easy way, across Canada, where it's all water. In fact, that's how amazing Grand Portage is and why the Northwest Company became so successful. I can tell you in two ways how important this place is in the world of transportation. Number one, from where I'm sitting right now with the canoe, hopefully bigger than the one next to me, from here I can actually reach the Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, Hudson's Bay, or the Gulf of Mexico, all by canoe, and never have to portage or walk more than 10 miles at one time. That would be the longest walk I would ever have to do. And I would imagine most of us in this chat could probably walk a 10-mile trail if they really had to. That's pretty amazing. From where I'm sitting right now, Canada offers me about 16 weeks of ice-free paddling per year. That's on an average year. Some years are more, some years are less. What's amazing about Grand Portage is that in the fur trade days, a canoe could reach the Atlantic Ocean from here in about 8 weeks. You can reach the Pacific coast in about 8 weeks. What does that mean? It means we're right in the center of the world here. It means if you take off from Grand Portage, you and a buddy, one of you goes to the Atlantic, one of you goes to the Pacific, you'd both be able to get to the oceans and back and meet up for dinner in one summer of paddling, because we're right in the center. And the Northwest Company discovered all that with Mackenzie. And what did we do about those routes? Well, everywhere along the route, everywhere we found groups of native people willing to trade, we built a trading post. Everywhere, approximately every 60 to 70 miles. The company ends up building trading posts all the way to the Arctic, all the way to the Pacific coast. Before long, the Northwest Company had established a string of 120 trading posts, or as we like to call them around here, basically Walmarts in the wilderness. That's what they were. We're sitting here building trading posts in native villages, telling those native people, no, you don't have to go up to Hudson Bay and stand outside their posts and pound on their doors. Now we're going to build a trading post right in your neighborhood. Tell us what you want. We'll bring it in for you. We'll bring in the kettles, the blankets, the beads, the tobacco. We'll bring all those products in. And the company knew they needed to bring in higher quality items. They intercepted a letter, in fact, where natives were complaining that the red blankets of Hudson Bay were too orangey, and the buttons on their clothing constantly fell off, and the axes, when it got too cold in winter, would become brittle and break. So the Northwest Company brought in higher quality trade goods. They bought them in bulk to outfit their 120 trading posts. The Northwest Companies, and they get pretty successful here. They're doing pretty well. We're now pushing into the 1790s, and we are at the peak of the fur trade. I don't care what fur trade we're going to talk about, whether it's the Great Lakes Canadian fur trade we're talking about tonight, the Western fur trade, the fur trade of the Upper Missouri, the Ural Mountain, the Russian fur trade. The fur trade throughout history in North America has never been bigger than 1790. 1790 is the big decade. It was the time when the peak of furs were being obtained, the greatest number of furs. It was the time when the desire for furs in Europe was at its peak. 1790s, it was exploding right then. That's when the fur trade was magic. In 1790s, the fur trade was going through Grand Portage stronger than it ever had. Canoes loaded with paddlers, the voyageurs, hiring 1,500 of those men in a single year. Once again, remember, there's about 250 living in Grand Portage right now. Could you imagine having 12 to 1,500 men coming down the Grand Portage Trail? So every single summer, the brigades would come down from those trading posts with furs to Grand Portage. At the same time, brigades of canoes would come from warehouses in Montreal with new trade goods. They would all meet here. 25-foot-long canoes with about 6 paddlers each coming from Montreal with new kettles, blankets, beads, tobacco, and such. 36-foot canoes, anywhere from 8 to 16 paddlers. Those 8 to 16 paddlers in the 36-foot canoes are coming from Montreal, excuse me. The 25-foot canoes are coming out of the interior. They're the ones going through the boundary waters. 2 types of canoes. The 25-foot canoes are known as north canoes because they're coming from the north. The 36-foot canoes from Montreal, they're called Montreal canoes because they're coming from Montreal. See, fur trade doesn't have to be difficult. Pretty simple, but they all meet here because remember, here we're in the middle. It works simple. The canoes that brought the trade goods from Montreal go back with furs for world distribution. The ones that came down with the furs go back with trade goods to resupply the Walmarts in the wilderness. That's how it worked here, folks. Grand Portage, usually a pretty sleepy little quiet place, except for summer when all the paddlers arrived here. That was, of course, called rendezvous. Yes, the gathering of the canoe brigades, all happening here. Now, the best year the company had here was in 1793. We kind of showed Hudson Bay a thing or two. We might be quiet little Grand Portage today, but during the fur trade, at a time when furs are the greatest commodity in the world, we're talking the oil of its day, Grand Portage was responsible for as much as 75 to 78% of the world's furs. Let me tell you this, if 78% of the world's oil came rolling down the Grand Portage Trail every day, you know we'd be in the news every day. That's what it was back then, folks. 78% of the world's furs coming through Grand Portage. Amazing. Now, the number one fur, of course, we talked about it. It's the beaver, right? How many beaver came through here during the height? I get that question all the time. Let's get rid of the ermine. Let's get rid of the mink. Let's get rid of the raccoons. Let's get rid of the foxes. Let's get rid of the bears. Let's get rid of all the other furs. Okay, let's just look at beaver. 1793, right at the peak of the Northwest Company's success at Grand Portage. How many beaver came through here? How many beaver were brought down from the 120 trading posts to Grand Portage before they got rebundled and shipped to Montreal, eventually to the world? In 1793, it was the best year the Northwest Company had. That year, not counting all other furs, that year, just in beaver, not Justin Bieber, I didn't say that, just in beaver. That year, just in beaver alone, the company brought in 183,000 beaver. That's 1 year, folks. Remember I told you early on by 1800, only 600 Eurasian beaver may have existed? Well, we're looking at the Northwest Company at Grand Portage that shipped out 183,000 beaver in 1 year. 183,000. Yeah, that's 4 times more than Hudson Bay Company could do, making Grand Portage the home of the world's largest fur company that ever existed. But it didn't survive that long. By 1800, the world's a different place and things are going to occur. By 1800, the company already knows they need to leave US soil. Because of the Jays Treaty in the 1790s, British fur companies need to leave US soil. So we're going to get out of here. And we don't go far. We want to stay where we are. So we just skip up a half hour to what we call Thunder Bay, Ontario today. It's up there they build Fort Kaministiquia on the Kaministiquia River, eventually be renamed Fort William after William McGilvray of the Fur Company. It is there the Northwest Company continues. Unfortunately, the fur trade is starting to die and they don't have the best route. Obviously, the Grand Portage is the quickest way to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific or the Pacific to the Atlantic. Even today, I see Canoe is still crossing the entire North American continent. And when they get to the Grand Portage, I welcome them and say, well, you made it halfway. But leaving Fort William, of course, they're going to have to use a different route. They use the Kaministiquia River. Then they go through Dog Lake, a larger portage, a larger swamp. They have to lessen every canoe by several bales. That's not good for profits. When you have to lessen the canoe bales, that's because the canoes were dragging in those shallower waters. Eventually, that trail came back down to the boundary waters near Lac La Croix. Hence the crossing, La Croix, of the two trails, the Grand Portage and the Kaministiquia route. So the Northwest Company continued, but they never brought in the furs they used to. That's because the fur trade was coming to an end. Now, it's 7 o'clock. It's time to get to that ugly part of the story where we talk about what happened to the fur trade. Yeah, it's ending. And like everything in the world, you can't say it died because of this. People like doing that. It died because fashion changed. It's died because beaver ran out. Well, you know, there's truth in all those things. There's a lot of reasons. 1790s, of course, French Revolution, that doesn't help. They were buying an awful lot of furs. Europe's kind of on fire going on there. Even Spain's on fire a little bit. There's strife over in Europe, so furs aren't being sold as well. There's less beaver coming in now. You can't take 183,000 a year and not expect a little bit of depletion happening at that point. You know, we got competition happening, of course. Hudson Bay is sick of being beat by the Northwest Company. So one of the first things they do is they start getting off the bay and they start coming into the interior of Canada and they start building trading posts right in native villages. See, they're getting smart. They even start using birch bark canoes. Yeah, Hudson Bay starts copying everything we do. Yeah, so now they're in native villages as well. Heck, it looks like Burger King and McDonald's on the same block. How many times have we seen that? Yeah, no different in the fur trade. So now we have all these competition. We got competition because some of the posts we abandoned in the States. Yeah, there's this guy called John Jacob Astor, American Fur Company. Eventually, he's going to move into those locations and build some of those posts back up. So we got issues going on. 1800 is also a unique year because one of the beaver replacements come in. Yep. 1800, we see the first shipment of nutria. Nutria, yes, a large giant water rat from South America. They introduced them in Louisiana and Texas in the 1920s for the fur market, and now they're regretting they ever did that. So nutria is going over. They're making fine, luxurious nutria hats in London, which sound a lot better than luxurious water rat hats. So we got nutria. We got competition with Hudson Bay. We got a slower trade route. It's not looking good for our Northwest Company folks. It's just not looking good at all. What's going to happen? Yeah. Well, let's not forget, we also have an issue starting in 1797, a little thing called the silk hat. Yeah. Silk hat looks just like a beaver hat. Heck, from a distance, you really can't tell them apart. Of course, silk hat's not waterproof, not long lasting, but it's cheap, about 3 to 4 times cheaper. So people are buying those because they can't afford the beaver because the beaver's jacked up in price because there's less of them. We got to charge more. It's just ending. Hudson Bay is trying everything they can to keep alive. Northwest Company is trying everything they can to keep alive. They start getting mad at each other. That leads to bloodshed. If you start looking into things like the Pemmican Wars and the Seven Oaks massacre, what's happening there is, of course, we're fighting over a food supply that the Hudson Bay Company wants to use for their settlers in the Red River area. And we want to use buffalo meat to project us into the interior where more beaver are in the Northwest. So we fight over that control of that food product, buffalo or pemmican, which is just dried buffalo. So bloodshed's happening there, literally killing and shooting. You know, that's an amazing thing. We talk about that killing and shooting and stabbing between Northwest Company and Hudson Bay. When people do visit me at Grand Portage, they're always asking about that big fence around the fur post. They go, why do you have a big fence? Who's attacking you guys? Well, no one's attacking us. You see, most of the violence that occurs in the fur trade is euro on euro. You see a lot of that, especially with Hudson Bay versus Northwest. Now, if you go a little south of here, you go around, let's say, just south of Duluth a few miles, you run into a contested area where you got the Dakota and the Ojibwe fighting against each other. So the violence usually has been native on native and euro on euro, but you don't see much of that native and euro violence people want to always hear about. I think they're in love with those John Wayne movies a little too much. We don't really have that here in this part of the country. So why do we have a wall? As long as we're sitting here talking about that big wall that everyone likes to see when they visit us. This is the way I explain our big wall to people that come to Grand Portage or any fur post site you might see that has the beautiful stockade or depot around it. You got to compare that to a hardware store. Let's say you want to build that new deck at your house. You run down to Menards or Lowe's or Home Depot, and they tell you, go get your lumber outside the building. You drive into the chain link fence and pick up your lumber because the lumber is usually not inside. It's outside in the chain link fence in the lumber yard. You drive out of the lumber yard, you pay your ticket, and you go home. Now that chain link fence surrounding that lumber yard, was that there to keep people out from attacking the hardware store yesterday? It's there to keep people out from stealing. Has nothing to do. It's more of an anti-theft device than an anti-attack device. No one's attacking us, but we can't trust people. And I'm not talking any native that lives in the area. We're a British company, Northwest Company. We got 1,200 French Canadians outside the walls too. There's not a lot of love there with the company. So that's why these fur posts have these walls. But eventually, we talked about the fur trade happening with the nutria causing a problem and all these other problems we're having. The competition between the two companies, the lack of furs, the lack of beaver, silk hats, nutria hats. There's no room for two giant fur trade companies anymore. So by 1821, it's over, folks. 1821, the two great fur companies merge. 1821 is when the Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company merge. They merge together and continue on under the Hudson Bay name, which of course in one form or another is still around today, running department stores and stuff. By the 1970s, they're basically out of the fur business. But the company, at least on paper, owned by an American, I believe right now. Last I heard, it was Mr. Zucker who owned the company. Is still around, but the Northwest Company no longer is, unless you say it is, kind of, because the two companies merge. It was no hostile takeover that some people like to say. It was a simple merger between the two companies. There was a thought at that time to try to keep the fur trade alive. Even though the fur trade was dying, there was a thought that since Lewis and Clark had returned from the West, in the American West, that they exclaimed that there was beaver out there, which got kind of hyped up a lot. So we start to see that start of the Western fur trade. Now that's that fur trade I said we're not really going to talk about when I started, Well, we'll just tell you a little bit about that. So the Western fur trade begins, and that's something that we're going to see coming out of not Michilimackinac in Michigan or Grand Portage. That's your St. Louis-based fur trade. And that's where we're going to see more of the American fur companies' activities as well. But they also, kind of like our early fur trade, has those independents. Those guys, we call the mountain men, who are moving independently into the West, and they can sell their furs. So we're finally seeing a place where we have basically Europeans obtaining furs. That's your Western fur trade. That's not our fur trade. So we finally have found our white grizzled trappers. But the problem is the American West just didn't have the beaver. Some of those fur companies in the American West, they'd have good years of 20,000 beaver. 20,000, 30,000. How's that sound to our 183,000 we had at Grand Portage? It ain't nothing. So yeah, so the problem with the beaver in the American West was that the American West, first off, is pretty dry compared to the Canadian West. So you find more water, you find more beaver. It's that simple. Also, up in the Canadian West of the fur trade of the Great Lakes, we had all these native people supplying furs, thousands and thousands of them. In the American West, well, you were mostly dealing with, at least in the beaver trade, you know, a lot of guys who were coming out to trap beaver that were coming from places like Kentucky and Tennessee. Guys we call the mountain men, guys who were telling you they were taking all the beaver on the other side of this mountain. The problem is when they got to the other side of the mountain, they'd never been there before. It could be a desert. Guys don't know where they're going half the time out there. But that fur trade continued for a while. It was all right, but it wasn't the big boom they were hoping for to bring back beaver. The fur trade of our Great Lakes, it ended pretty much in 1820. Hudson Bay continued on, like I said, but the great years of the fur trade was over. We could continue with that story another day on the Hudson Bay Company, but we were here, of course, to talk about the role Grand Portage played. Grand Portage today, still an amazing place. Like I said, what are the chances that the greatest place in the world to paddle a canoe? Once again, let's repeat what I said earlier. Reaching the Atlantic Ocean, Arctic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Hudson Bay, and Gulf of Mexico, all without a portage longer than 10 miles. 8 weeks to the Atlantic, 8 weeks to the Pacific, perfectly in the middle of the world. Yes, I think without a question, this is the greatest place in the world to paddle a canoe. How is it in this world, in one place, a small, tiny little place, Grand Portage, how can Grand Portage be the greatest? How can the greatest place in the world to paddle a canoe just happen to be perhaps the greatest place in the world to make a canoe? How can that be? I'm not that smart of a man to figure that one out, but it happened right here in Grand Portage. You have some questions, I'll be more than glad to kind of get in there. I know we kind of skipped over trade goods. I didn't talk about material culture as much, items that were designated for the native trade. You know, the most important thing I will tell you on trade goods, which can be a whole nother topic of items, which ones came from Germany, France, Italy, Spain, South America, Africa, Asia. The one thing that people don't understand, I'll tell you two things before we jump into questions. My two favorite fur trade facts I like telling people who visit. One would have to definitely be that the majority of trade goods traded in the fur trade, 70% of the trade goods were textiles, pre-made clothing, blankets, and bolts of fabric. Yeah, you know, if you come in and trade for a shirt, you'll need a new one next year. If you trade for a kettle or an axe, probably not. So it's something you go through quicker. So textiles, number one trade good. People always want to tell me it's probably beads or alcohol, and those things are good choices, but in a way, but textiles is king. That's one of the big things I always tell people, is the advantage of textiles in the fur trade.
Well, awesome. I am so excited to be learning so much, and you were so adamant and just sucked me right in. So I'm sure that's how other people felt too. I would encourage you, if anybody out there has questions, this is a little earlier than expected, so we have lots of time then. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you want to put a question into the chat, this is a great time to continue that conversation. We did have a question earlier on about Europe and the beavers. Did they have numbers anywhere? I mean, I know we said the greatest land for it at all, but could you tell us just a brief moment about what was happening in Europe about the trade?
Yeah. Well, it was that, they say it was around Holland where that craze for those beaver hats really took off. I mean, it took over everywhere, even China, for these hats. But Holland was right in the center hotspot of beaver activity. Obviously, the Scandinavian states is the last stronghold for the Eurasian beaver. That's where they remained the longest. But there were beaver all through England and Scotland and stuff like that. And when Holland started with that hat craze, anything around there was totally wiped out. That was the first spot that was hit massively. And the fur trade really is something, if you could take it down to the minute of different years, we could be talking differently in 1782 to 1796, because there could be a craze for wolverines happening in France in 1792, but we can't get rid of a wolverine in 96, but everyone wants red foxes in China that year. There's also the other furs, usually it's martens and otters after beaver, which are important. But certain years in the furry trade had certain years where certain furs were more desired, and that played country by country. So I don't know if that answers it much. I mean, it's, and speaking of beaver too, this is a very important fact. We mentioned the white-bearded grizzled trapper numerous times tonight. And they're using traps. It was the great David Thompson, probably the world's greatest map maker, that defected Hudson Bay and started working here in Portage in 1797. He mentions that trap use, and it looks pretty true, trap use isn't really happening around here till about 1804, and we leave here in 1802, the Northwest Company does. So the height of the fur trade, the 1790s, is not even happening with traps. So that leads to the question, if they're not using traps, how are they obtaining beaver? And let me tell you, because it's pretty fascinating how beaver were actually obtained during the height of the fur trade. For the native people obtaining beaver, they knew that the beaver was at its peak when it was cold enough to have the thicker hides. And when it's cold enough, things freeze. Lakes and the rivers freeze up. So they would know where the dams are. They live out in the woods, of course. So they would see a dam. They'd walk over to the dam because it's ice on the water. And living in that area and looking at that situation, they know which side of the dam the water is deeper on. So knowing the beaver, when agitated, will try to get away from its predator, will dive deeper. They chop with chisels. Now, these chisels were made of stone, of course, and antler, but we're going to bring in iron chisels for trade. Native people would chisel holes through the ice and drop a net, 2 holes about the size of garbage can lids, about 8 feet apart, and drop a net through one hole and bring it up through the other, dropping a curtain of netting. Now, the nets used to be nettle fiber or cedar bark, but we're bringing in Irish linen nets for trade. So they could chisel these holes, drop a net, and pound on the beaver dam, trying to scare the 1 to 15 beaver that live in a dam out of that dam, because they know that you cannot, it's almost impossible to break into a dam. They're so amazingly constructed. There have been stories of guys trying to blow dams up on their property with dynamite, and they were unsuccessful. They're such strong structures that the natives knew we're not going to bust through this thing, especially a frozen dam. So they would chop through the ice, drop a net through one hole, bring it up to the other, then they'd climb up on top of the dam, pound on the dam, which scared the beaver, and the beaver think you're coming in after them. So they know, let's get out of here before they break in, and they jump into the water. They want to be safe, they jump into the deep side. They dive down into the deep side, and as they swim away, they get entangled into the nets, and the nets are pulled up, which means you can go out with your buddies with a chisel and a net and go out at breakfast and come back by lunch with several beavers. And even if you do have a heavy, expensive tended to break trap, you're reliant on waiting for the beaver to step on that. And it doesn't even work that fast. So that was the method that was employed in the fur trade.
Well, awesome. We are just pouring in with questions. So let me toss some of those out there. And I'm also going to invite Karen Blackburn, our director at Cook County Higher Ed, to help lead some of these questions too. So the next one I have is, did they transport the whole pelt back to Europe, or did they trim it down to reduce the volume, the transport volume?
Good question. The whole pelt went back. They were sold by the pound, but when they were selling them, a lot of times, not all the beaver, about 60%, 65% of the beaver went into hat industry. So they were using beaver for other reasons too. So, and those reasons, if you're making a coat out of it or gloves or mittens out of it, whatever, you want the hide. You're going to want the hide to cut and stitch together. So these bundles of beaver going back, they're not all designated for hats. So we just can't send that under fluff. We got to send the whole thing.
Here's another question.
And they're dried, not tanned.
Oh, all right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This question says, I am rereading George Nelson's journal, and he mentions in 1802 that there was an XY depot on the grounds east of the Northwest Company. I've been there a few times, but I cannot picture where it is. Can you give any insight?
Now, are we talking about the XY Company? His journal talks about the XY Company at Yellow River in Wisconsin, or is he talking about the XY Company here?
Here.
Yeah, it was just on the east side. And we're not 100% sure, because over time there was numerous fur companies here. So just because we find a line through archaeology, and we're constantly doing digs here, we still do digs about every year. When we find a stockaded line, it doesn't mean, oh, there's XY. It could have been Bob's trading post or David's trading post. So we cannot even say 100% for sure. All we can tell you, it's east of where we are. One person has it up by the old church. One person has it down where the reenactment has it. So it's tough to call, but yeah, it was right. And it continued on beyond. The XY Company, real quickly, is the company that broke away. It was Northwest Company. Mackenzie, who reached the Arctic and Pacific, he joined that company. It became Alexander Mackenzie's company. They call it the XY, and they were a third fur company. There's XY, Northwest, and Hudson Bay. But then after 1804 is when that company merged back in with us. So they were an offshoot that broke away and folded back in. But yeah, they were still operating here actually a couple of years after we left in 1802.
All right. And could you talk about the ecological effect of killing millions of mammals in the northern forest?
Yeah. There's no doubt about that. It was, I come across sometimes people say, you're nothing but a Hudson Bay basher. Well, you get that working 20 some years for the Northwest Company Fur Post. And I don't mean to be, but let's keep in mind too, that it was the great George Simpson, one of the great men of the Hudson Bay history, who was the first guy in the fur trade in the 1820s to say, no, you don't take every single beaver, you leave some seed behind. So that environmental method of not taking every single beaver, that's a Hudson Bay thing in the 1820s. The big, huge fur company, us, the Northwest Company, no, take every single thing. And that was the same thought you see even in the journals and of our people who supplied the furs to us. They would take everything, take it all. That's the way our fur hunters were operating. That's the way we were operating. There was none of this. I mean, one of the amazing quotes on the fur trade and environment is that if you don't paddle enough every day, you might get stuck in the ice and not get home before the freeze up occurs. So sometimes you're forced to paddle throughout the night. And this is through the Boundary Waters area even. And they would send a canoe ahead of them. And so the canoes wouldn't bash on rocks. They were told that anywhere you see rocks sticking out of the water that can affect the canoes coming behind you, just light some trees on fire on shore. And that way it'll light up the water so we don't run into those rocks. So the idea today of just paddling through an area and lighting random trees on fire and continuing, we go, what are you, nuts? But yeah, there really isn't a lot of, great environmental things you read about in the fur trade. Yeah, it's sad to say, but, and it comes from everywhere. It's not just the trappers. It's the trappers, it's the traders. They're all acting that way pre-1820, especially.
Another question is, how many brigades left Montreal each spring?
Yeah, one record says about 70 canoes were coming about a year. Those canoes, those 36 footers, they're carrying about 4 tons per canoe, which is a pretty amazing amount. You couldn't build a canoe 36 feet long out of aluminum, plastic, canvas, or Kevlar that could carry the weight of a birch bark. I mean, that's one of the amazing abilities about birch bark canoes, is that they're not only as light as any canoe made today, and lighter than most, they can carry more weight. But as many as 70 is one reference to how many would come. Whereas coming out of the interior, it's anyone's guess. We could have 100 trading posts, and some trading posts send 1 canoe down. Some trading posts sends 2 to 3 canoes down. One reference even was to 70 canoes a year being built at Grand Portage for the fur trade. So, yeah.
How were guns transported? Individually in crates?
They were in crates of 10. Yeah, 10 58 caliber Northwest trade muskets. Yeah, coming out of primarily Birmingham, England, made by primary builders were Barnett and Ketlin, and they were put into red woolen sleeves and laid 5 guns this way, 5 guns this way into a large crate that almost looks like a coffin. So 10 firearms, about 6 pounds per firearm.
Boy, you've got all the answers. Were there ever work crews sent out to improve or maintain some of the portage trails?
I think they were so heavily used at that time. I mean, it's what you find out. I mean, they're doing something, because there's parts of the Grand Portage today where you could see they have tossed large stones off to the side to make the trail better. And you can see that was done hundreds of years ago. But there's also stories of just the opposite, Karen, where we have records of one fur company is using the portage, and they notice that Hudson Bay is coming behind them. And the company was told to drop trees on the portage to make it more difficult for other companies. So yeah, just the opposite we see, actually.
Well, I have some questions that are popping up on my side too. Anything special to look for if somebody's hiking the Grand Portage Trail in 2021? Such as like Fort McCavitt?
Fort Charlotte?
They said MCKAVETT.
What's amazing about we have such beautiful hiking in Cook County, with Mount Josephine and Mount Rose up here and all that. And the Superior Hiking Trail is amazing too. I mean, you look left and you got endless Superior National Forest, and you look right, depending on which way you're going, and you got endless Lake Superior. I've seen a lot of people hike the Grand Portage Trail, and they come off it and they go, well, that's kind of boring. And that's the idea. When you're carrying 2 90-pound packs, you don't want to go up and downhill so you don't get vistas. It is that cut through the hills. So it's much more historic, as it is a gorgeous, beautiful, but the reward is at the end, because when you get to the end of the Grand Portage, you are truly at Fort Charlotte, the other depot at the other end of it, and it's a lovely view of the Pigeon River, and you're totally in remote area then. So I'm not saying it's a horrible trail, because that's what I work for, but yeah, it's not a trail that if you're looking for great vistas, you're not going to get that.
Historical that they would be looking for, like something that would be like, that is clearly a moment they can see.
Oh yeah. There's an area, that all these areas are marked too on a guide you can get from the park. When you're going through the cedar area, which was a popular area for gathering canoe materials. And you'll know that when you're walking through that area of nothing but huge 300-year-old cedars that were there during the fur trade. Talking about the beaver marsh, there's a huge walkway over a large beaver marsh that definitely has stories of the fur trade. So there's certain points, and when you get to Fort Charlotte, you can actually see indentations in the ground of where the fort once stood. So yeah, there's spots like that along the trail. The park right now is currently active in trying to find the rest stops. There's 16 rest stops along the Portage historically. Every half mile would be a rest stop or an overnight camping spot if needed. And right now we're working on trying to find all those. And we think we found a good number of them. And that's something to look forward to, that eventually a brochure will be made on that. What we don't want to do is throw signs up everywhere on the Portage. We're trying to keep the Portage as historic as it was. And that's a pretty amazing fact alone, removing, non-native vegetation. And, if a tree falls down and you go around it for 30 years until that tree rots, the trail keeps curving like that. So then we have to bring that trail back. So luckily we had enough guys walk that trail in 1790 and 1804 with readings and chains that we can bring back the trail. And we believe right now that the trail is somewhere 90-some% exactly to where it was.
Incredible. Well, somebody's asking, do you have any recommended reading materials that cover the Grand Portage and the trade that's not the Grand Portage story by Gilman?
Yeah, the Grand Portage story is great. I'm a big fan of journals, of course. I love that daily, today my chimney collapsed. Today I traded for a raccoon, and today, the dog ate all the leather windows in my house. And my favorite journal of all is one by a guy called Daniel Harmon, called 16 Years in the Indian Country. And the reason why I like that one is because it's a guy who is here, Daniel Harmon, and he is not one of the Scottish owners. And usually we always hear the story from those rich guys who own the company. He is not native, but he trades with the natives. He is married to a native woman and refuses to let her go. A big problem in the fur trade was marrying. The company allowed intermarriage. They promoted it. They wanted our voyageurs to marry, because if a woman's married to a voyageur, she's going to trade with Northwest and not Hudson Bay, most likely. There's a lot of reasons why you want to marry, in the fur trade. So Harmon has a native wife that he takes when he retires from the fur trade and goes back to the East Coast. He's not even allowed back into his town with this woman. So they have to find a different place to live, because he refuses to leave her ever. He says, even though we're not married in a church, we're still married under the eyes of God. And how can I leave her and my children? So he's in charge of the Voyageurs. He works for the British, and he's involved with trading and married to a native woman. So all three of those people we talked about, right? The British, the French, Canadians, and the natives. He's none of those three, but he can talk about all three. That makes him a perfect person to read about. So yeah, 16 Years in the Indian Country is probably my favorite journal. Making the Voyageur World, if you're just interested in voyageurs, is a fine book by Carolyn Padrukny. That's a good one if you're interested in voyageur life.
All right. What was the effect of the fur trade on the native populations? Because their food was being depleted by the taking of the beaver.
Oh yeah, I mean, we mentioned that little parable story early on, that you got all these extra hours now of doing things, and they're calling the shots. We have to remember that. The Northwest Company can't build a trading post someplace if we don't have the okay from the local populace first. And the local populace, when you read about stories of them trading, they're pretty amazing. I mean, they're saying, yeah, this is a nice knife from Sheffield, England, but we don't like it 4 inches. Make it 5 inches and we'll trade with you. This kettle's nice, but we need it a little deeper. Otherwise, we won't trade with you. The color on these blankets need to be redder or greener. Otherwise, we're not trading. They called the shots. They told us what they wanted. One of the greatest quotes I like in the fur trade is by a guy called Rolette, and it's mentioned in a guy called Kinsey's book called Wapan. Where he's at a dinner party, and he actually tells somebody he's a trader, and he says, I'm an Indian trader. I trade with natives for furs. And this woman at a dinner party, this is during the fur trade, literally tells him, I hate you people, because you go out there and you take advantage of these people. And that idea of selling Manhattan for a handful of beads has been around forever, since the fur trade began. And I think his answer is probably one of the greatest answers that Rolette had. He went to that woman and said, ma'am, let me tell you what, for 30 years, I've been an Indian trader. And for 30 years, I've tried taking advantage of these people, and I've yet to succeed. So the intent might be there, but it's not easy. They're getting what they want. And, you know, there was a great incident at Rainy Lake where natives laid beaver all the way from the canoe landing to the front door of the trading post, and was upset because liquor would not be traded anymore. The company was trying to cut back on the liquor trade. And I'm not going to lie, Northwest Company was the king of the liquor trade. You know, Hudson Bay, they were angels compared to what we did. I mean, we pushed more liquor than anyone in the fur trade, unfortunately. But there was a group of natives that was upset. They would not trade with us unless the liquor trade continued. So what are you to do? It's your business. It's your job. So yeah, was it good for natives? You know, that's probably the greatest question. We can have a whole hour and a half on that one, Karen. But here's my favorite answer to that. And it comes from an artist. A lot of you might know him, Carl Galboy. Net Lake, I think Boys Fort, he's a member of, professor of Native Studies and an artist. Carl Galboy used to ask his students all the time, what's the worst thing about the fur trade for us Native people? What was the worst thing about the fur trade? And some would say, the trade in alcohol. All right, that's a pretty good answer. Some people would say, the country wife problem of French Canadians coming into the fur trade, taking a 15-year-old wife, an average trading post. Now, we're not talking Grand Portage because we're not a trading post. We're a Walmart distribution center that runs 120 trading posts. We have to figure that out. But an average trading post, like the one in Pine City, Minnesota, that's reconstructed, an average trading post in the fur trade only lasts about 2 years before the area is depleted of furs. So voyageurs would come in, marry 15-year-old Native women, and then after 2 years, they would burn down the post, move to a new location, and they were leaving those women behind because they knew they would get a new 15 or 16-year-old wife at the next post. So everywhere the Northwest Company was going, it was leaving young women with children everywhere. Devastating to a culture, horrible. So people would say it's the country wife problem. Some people would say it was the liquor problem. Here's what Carl Galboy says. He says, those are all good answers. But the worst thing about the fur trade for Native people was that it ended. Because when the fur trade was going on, you wanted something, you told the fur companies, they brought it to you, and you gave them furs and you got what you wanted. When the fur companies left, the governments came in. And when the governments came in, you got allotments. This is what you get. Here's your flour. Can I get some sugar? No, you got flour this year. That's what you get. They no longer had a say. In the fur trade, they had a say. So I like to think that's pretty powerful. You know, in a lot of ways, it was an equal, you know, they didn't have to trade and they chose to, but for exactly what they wanted.
Well, we have, I think, just a couple more questions. What happened to the Voyager who blew out his knee or twisted an ankle or threw out his back in the middle of a trip?
Yeah, I always love that one too, because people always say, oh, that they wore those sashes to avoid hernias. And, I think I've only seen one. There's several books that say hernia is #1 cause of death to voyageurs. And I think I've only seen 1 or 2 ever listed of a death from that. A lot of times they're left behind and go and hobble back to the nearest post. I mean, you're usually 60 miles from another post, no matter where you are. They're almost always a day apart from one or another. So sending somebody back with an injured guy, that happens a lot. But yeah, you don't stop the whole brigade, because the last thing you want to do is be late going back to your post and then find out that the last 400 miles, the river is frozen. Nobody wants to have that, you know. There are stories of men coming down from such far north in the Athabascan region up by Peace River who make it down to Grand Portage, and they had so many accidents coming down to Grand Portage with canoe problems that by the time they got here, they had one day to drop off their furs, pick up new trade goods, turn around the next day, and start heading back before freeze up. And these are guys who were coming down here being told that when they got to Grand Portage, there was going to be people of the opposite sex. There was going to be alcohol. There was going to be a party. There was going to be bread from ovens. There was going to see people from your hometown. You're going to see 1,500 people instead of the same 20 guys, the stinky guys you've been living with for 6 months. All this will happen when you get to Grand Portage. And then they're told when they get to Grand Portage that the next day they have to start heading back.
That would be terrible. I have one of our listeners is thinking 180 pounds. That's a lot. Is that really the amount that they were carrying?
Yeah, a lot of times you're contracted to carry a lot of the contracts call for about 5 bales. Bales are about 90 pounds, but the lightest ones could be 60. So if you got 5 things to carry, you're not carrying them all at the same time. So most men carry 2. So you're carrying anywhere at the lightest, probably 150 to most 180. But the way a portage works is that you're using that strap on your head, that tump line it's called, but you actually lean forward. One pack doesn't work. You need that second pack, and that actually leans you forward enough that if you don't move your feet, you'll fall on your face. So it's literally pushing you, but what that pushing does is aligns your spine. So basically, you know, if you put 180 in a backpack and sit up straight, you'll go right back. But you need that weight to push you forward. That's why the second one is so high up. So you're literally doing a dog trot, and it's about a half mile every time. So an 8.5 mile portage, like the Grand Portage, is 2 bales, 8.5 miles long, right? So you got 2 bales, 150 to 180. You lean forward, you do a half mile trot, drop those 2, walk back, pick up your next 2, go a half mile trot, walk back, pick up your last one, and then take your buddy's 5th pack, or your buddy gets your 5th pack because someone's got to grab the canoe and go a half mile. So it's short half mile increments, leaning forward, using that weight to drive you forward.
That makes me tired. Just think about it, Carl.
Right?
No one likes the portage.
One of the last questions we have on here is, were there any non-native women present in Grand Portage?
Yeah, no, there wasn't none, you know, and that's, you know, and that's a great place to end on too, you know, because, you know, we didn't get into a lot of the real heavy, juicy stuff like alcohol trade and native. And we talked a little bit about that country wife problem. You know, some of the great stuff on native women in the fur trade, you know, if you've ever seen our park film, and if you haven't, I suggest you look at it on our website. It's a fantastic film, but we intentionally made the star of the show a female woman, because everyone coming into a fur trade post, again, wants to see that grizzled guy. But it's a female woman that can go anywhere. She could be in the Voyageur camp. She could be in the gentleman's hall. She could marry a gentleman. She could marry a Voyageur. She makes the decisions a lot of times for tribes. She's in the, you know, a female woman in the fur trade was amazing. The company here would hire native women to go find new locations to build fur posts. We would hire native women as guides. What is that telling us? That is telling us that the Northwest Company in the 1780s and 90s would hire young 20, 30-year-old native women, telling them to go build a new post over here, to communicate with that tribe, because you know people in that group, be in charge of the 30 or 40 voyageurs we're sending with you, have them build a trading post there, and then come back and let us know when it's ready to be run. I mean, we are basically in the 1790s hiring minority women to do these roles and paying them. You don't see that in the 1890s by multi-million-dollar companies hiring minority women. That's something the fur trade was doing. We got records of the Northwest Company here hiring native women to do many tasks and paying them, and being in charge of all these French Canadians.
Oh
So,
gosh, Carl, this has just been such a fascinating and educational night and fun. I am excited to learn from you more in the future. I'm hoping to recruit you back for more. I feel very grateful for Anna Deshab that who was willing to recommend you for this and said, this is going to be such a treat. And she was so spot on. I just could not enjoy it more. I do say that we are having another talk coming up on the fur trade on December 11th. I encourage people to check that out. That includes up in Thunder Bay, we have speakers as well as all across the shore and people attending from both Canada and the United States. So it's all virtual. You can join for one session or more. If you have something that you were just so interested in tonight, because any piece of this, I'm sure could have been a full-on conversation, please let me know and we'll see if we can bring Carl back again to talk on this. And just a reminder, he said he has a 6 hours on this, just this piece alone. So you got the short version, and I think we could all have asked for even much longer and been well entertained on this chilly night. I just want to say thank you, and everybody in the chat is saying thank you.